You remember from our previous study that the period of time between the anointing of the first king Saul in 1020 BC and the death of Solomon in 922 BC marks a period of about 100 years known as the United Monarchy, with kings Saul, David, and Solomon reigning over a united Israel. After the death of Solomon, the northern tribes, however, secede. They're tired of sending money to Jerusalem and having their young men conscripted for war and for battle. And so the kingdom is between Israel in the north and Judah in the south. It's important to remember that division because it'd be hard of the Bible without remembering Israel in the north and Judah. During this time of the divided kingdom, God sends many prophets to try to help the people remain faithful to their covenant with God. There's a whole succession of kings both in Israel and Judah, some good, some not so good, and some really awful. And the prophets can see what some of the people are unable to see, is that they're drifting further and further and further away from God's call and claim on them as a people and as a nation. And God sends many prophets, Elijah being one of the most fiery prophets of the Old Testament. We read about Elijah's story in 1 Kings beginning with chapters 16 and 17. Chapters 18 and 19 are some really interesting and fantastic stories about Elijah's ministry, calling people to care for one another and calling people to worship the one true God. Those are the two major themes of the prophets of the Old Testament, trying to remind people that it's important not to overlook the poor or the elderly or the needy. Don't just trample people underfoot. And then the other concern is to make sure God remains first. Don't worship God and gods, because God won't tolerate competition. The people of Israel and Judah were not only worshiping Yahweh, but also worshiping the many Canaanite gods of the peoples that surrounded them. We move into the time of King Josiah, one of the great reformers of this time. And under Josiah's reform, the temple in Jerusalem is cleaned up, and the Passover is reinstated. And they even find a book that they've lost, apparently, during this period of time. And they read the law again, and Josiah determines that they need to go back to the law. Jeremiah is one of the main prophets during this time of Israel's history. And Jeremiah is at first encouraged by Josiah's reforms, though later he becomes disillusioned and predicts the downfall of Judah. Both Israel and Judah do fall eventually. In 722 BC, the Assyrians of the north lay siege to Israel and conquer the northern tribes, the northern kingdom. Judah hangs on by a thread for another 150 years until the armies of Babylon surround Jerusalem, destroy finally Jerusalem in 587 BC, and carry all of the leading citizens and all the leadership of the country into captivity in Babylon. Just to let the reader feel the pain of this time in history, the writer includes the story of the final king Zedekiah, who has all of his children slaughtered in front of him, and then his eyes are gouged out, so that's the last thing he sees. And then he's carried off into captivity into Babylon. An awful, awful time and period in the history of God's people, with the fall of Israel in 722 BC and the fall of Judah in 587 BC. We think we can sidestep judgment. We think we can blame someone else, but eventually we cannot. And both Israel and Judah come under judgment. They fall and enter into a terrible period of time in their nation's history. Judah remains in captivity in Babylon for 40 years.